everyone. My name is Senowa Mize-Fox, and I am the Movement Engagement Manager for Climate Justice and Just Transition at the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. And I am honored to be your moderator today for this breakout session, Redistributing Resources, Federal Money, and Philanthropy. So I want to welcome everyone in the room. I was also going to welcome everyone virtually, but unfortunately, but this is being recorded, so hopefully folks can watch it after. Today, we're trying to answer a couple of key questions. Can public funding and philanthropy be redistributed to shift power? What are the legal barriers to shifting resources to address the impacts of systemic racism? And what are the opportunities? And with those questions, our goals today are to describe the landscape of funding that could be redistributed to support systemic change, including current opportunities in federal funding and philanthropy, identify legal limitations to redistribution intended to address historic discrimination, structural racism, and wealth inequality, and envision opportunities for shifting resources and the infrastructure needed to enact that vision. So hopefully we can do that all in like 45 minutes, an hour, we'll see. But I would like to introduce our panelists today. So we have Jackie Patterson, the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project. Daniel Aldana Cohen, thank you, assistant professor of sociology at the University of California at Berkeley and the Climate and Community Project. And Latisha Nixon Jones, who is a professor of law at Jacksonville University, focusing on disaster law, insurance, and economic recovery for vulnerable populations. And I want to welcome Latisha, who just came on last minute. So thank you. Our other panelist, unfortunately, is sick, so we wish Al a speedy recovery. So I am doing double duty today, moderating and talking first. So when we talk about redistributing resources, what are the resources? What is the landscape? So I want to kind of lay that out, and I'm going to give some broad strokes. I'm not going to get deep in the weeds, but we do have a Q&A, so if there are specific questions, hopefully I can answer those. So there are about $3.5 to $4 trillion currently in federal investments through 4 bills that are available for climate and infrastructure. Climate and environmental infrastructure projects. The American Rescue Plan Act, the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. Okay, so these 4 bills. And we also have the Justice 40 initiative, which is supposed to ensure that 40% of qualifying federal investments go to disenfranchised communities. What are these investments being used for? So many things. So we've got clean energy and energy efficiency, clean transit, affordable and sustainable housing, training and workforce development, remediation and reduction of legacy pollution, development of clean water infrastructure, just to name a few. Like I said, giving very broad strokes. I really want to ground us in knowing that this is a historic moment. There has not been a federal investment this large since the Great Society Bills of 1964 to 1965. So I really want to let that sink in. The last time the federal government invested public dollars this heavily, we were just coming out of legal segregation, 59 years ago. There is an opportunity here to get this money to grassroots communities on the front lines of the climate crisis, those who have been historically disinvested in because of segregation, redlining, and racialized capitalism, to name just a few. Those who are still facing unjust discrimination. There is a reason why it has been 59 years since a federal investment of this size has happened, and we are already feeling the backlash. There is a real political urgency here in ensuring that these dollars don't get reabsorbed. Grassroots organizers helped get us here, and now it is our turn. And it's also philanthropy's turn. And that's what I will be speaking about today, or my part. So philanthropy has a significant role to play here in ensuring that these federal dollars reach these communities on the ground. The process from preparing to apply to receiving and utilizing funds is riddled with obstacles that cannot be met by many of these groups with limited capacities. Funders need to support capacity and infrastructure building among grassroots and frontline communities to ensure that these federal funds are making the deepest possible impact. I also want to be clear that this conversation today is a conversation about building power and leveling the playing field. This batch of federal funding is a microcosm of resources, but we need y'all to understand as lawyers, maybe funders, organizers in this room, that these dollars can have a tremendous impact, and philanthropy can kind of support them going further. So to kind of close out before we hand it over to our wonderful panelists, I want to dig in a little bit into concrete ways in which philanthropy can support this process. So we're talking about bridge loans while communities are waiting for money to come in, funding for infrastructure and capacity building to get frontline communities to the point where they can even apply for this funding. You might hear the term that projects need to be shovel ready, right? You need to be ready to go. And many of these communities, they don't have those resources to even get to that point, right? So philanthropy can help support that, right? And so we're talking about, you hear the term technical assistance very often, workforce development, and also something we're going to talk about today, funding for legal support to navigate. There's retaliation for applying for these funds, right? And other challenges that come up. Looking at funding for communication efforts to ensure communities know that this money is available, to help persuade states and local governments to utilize this money. Also asking for funders to dig into their endowments, right? But by law, you only have to give away 5% of your endowment each year, which should be the floor, not the ceiling. But for many funders, it is the ceiling. And the time is now to fund heavily, right? The federal, I hear from funders and from movement groups that, oh, well, federal funding is going to fill that gap for environmental justice communities. There's J40, it doesn't, we don't need to deal with this, right? Federal funding's got it. But that is actively not true. I want to that is absolutely not true. Funders should be funding more, not less, in light of these federal dollars, because we are on a time crunch. I do not like to promote a false urgency, but this truly is a political urgency. So when I say dig into your endowments, I mean really dig into your endowments. So I have some more detailed ways that pooled funds are supporting this, but I want to make sure that we get on to our other panelists. So, Latisha, I'm actually going to start with you as our newest panelist, putting you on the spot. So, what are some of the challenges and tensions under existing law around federal funding and cautions about legal trends? I'm going to start there.
All right, hello everyone. So I'm going to ground my answers in the work that I've already done. One, because I just came on 10 minutes ago, and then two, because it kind of allows for perspective. So in 2016, over 90% of Baton Rouge ended up flooding, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And so it was an unnamed storm. So it was things that many people were unprepared for. And in 2017, through Southern University Law Center, we created a disaster legal clinic. Through this clinic, we were able to fund and help over 200 families either get jobs, unemployment, retain their homes, fight FEMA, all of those things. But the largest sum of money came through an appropriation through the Community Development Block Grant Program. Okay? Because we are so very familiar with disasters in Louisiana, we were able to get that program up within 18 months, which is generally not heard of. Okay? 18 months is a long time if your house is damaged, if you have been displaced. Okay? So when I say 18 months, it is not without the perspective that that is still a long time. Okay? So 18 months comes, we have over, I believe, $4 million in funding just to get up, get running. 2 years from now, there's urgency because now we have to expend this funding. It's not that the people didn't need it. It's not that the money wasn't there, right? But every time there's a new appropriation, HUD has to create all of the new specs in order for that program. There's new applications. There's a new bid process for who's going to actually distribute those funds. And then once the program's up and running, on the consumer side, you have issues of who's the actual owner. You have scammers. You have duplication of benefits. You have the reassignment of benefits, so where owners will give reassignment of their ability to recover to roofers, to contractors, to scammers, right? So again, money's there, the need is there, but the pipeline to get the money to where it actually has to be has to go hand in hand. And so what we've been able to do is to start to educate individuals on how, prior to when that CGBD grant comes through, what do you need to have? And so we worked with philanthropy agencies such as Appleseed, and we identified one of the major issues was heirship property. And so we had owners that may have had 6 children. Once they died, someone may be living in the house, the other 5 decedents are gone, but there was never a succession open. FEMA will not give those funding. HUD cannot also give those funding. So we created an affidavit of succession, meaning we can get everyone to sign the affidavit that proves ownership, that allows you to be able to recover. We want to make sure that we start to do the same thing with the additional funding. So we need to have legal mechanisms that are in place that will address the need. So 3 specific things. The identification of who are the vulnerable populations. So if we're looking at individuals that have language barriers, individuals that have identification or documentation barriers. If we're looking at who needs ownership, okay, what type of ownership is needed? Is it simply proving a percentage of ownership or full ownership? And then lastly, are the rules too broad or too vague? Okay, meaning if you look at how everyone receives stimulus, or some people receive stimulus, that was funded through the Stafford Act. The Stafford Act is what allows us to be able to recover from FEMA. It was never meant to be a vessel for pandemics. So we want to make sure as we're looking, as this money is funded to the states, that they are not creating either overly broad rules that will leave that money with the state, or overly vague rules that prevents it to getting to the people with the need. So remember, money's there, the need is there. Now we have to create the legal vehicle to get it there.
Thank you so much, Latisha, for laying out some of those challenges. Jackie, I would like to pass it to you. So even in the light of these existing challenges, how can we redistribute public and private funds in ways that shift power rather than reinforce the power imbalance?
Thank you so much. First, I think we need to really shift our mindset around federal funding as if it's kind of an other. We have to recognize that it is our funding and that we need to really seize that power. So that mindset, I think, often gets lost, and it's almost like we're supplicants at someone else's table, but it's really our table, and we need to remember that. And with that, we need to start making sure that we're not just kind of training communities to shuffle to these guidelines that are put forward in a way that are so restrictive that it actually makes it so that we're just kind of not only shuffling along to get the money, but even the money is so constrained that it can't actually fuel our liberation. And so we need to really have the lens to look at the funding guidelines, look at both how the funding is accessed, but also what's allowed in terms of the spending of the funding. And we need to push for the types of changes that we need to affect change. We know that, in the words of Audre Lorde, that the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. So there's only so far we can go, but it doesn't mean we just kind of put up our hands and say there's nothing that can be done. We also know that as we were saying before, that philanthropy can help to supplement this, so that we're actually organizing towards that systems change that we need, so that the federal funding then leverages the real systems change and ownership that we need to be pushing for. I was recently a reviewer on NOAA grants, and I was struck by the guidelines that, they had, because of the Justice 40, they had some of the right language in there, so to speak, in terms of what was being required and what these applications were being judged by. But they were so loose that you could see how that reflected in the applications that came through. So they talked about how you need to focus on disadvantaged communities, quote unquote. They weren't as specific as they could have been, for sure, on what that meant. And then they also weren't as specific as they could have been in terms of what meaningful engagement looks like and what leadership and decision making looks like. So I looked at some of the applications, and it was just like mentioning disadvantage at random points in the application, but it didn't reflect in any way that they were centering, much less having anything that even resembled decision making. And then they separated me from the other people who were reviewing the proposals, so you weren't even given an opportunity to calibrate and kind of. So there was just so much wrong with that process. And at best, one would be grading on a curve in terms of these applications, because there was only one that was even marginally viable as it relates to actually centering frontline community leadership. And that was extremely disappointing, because then you imagine like what kind of reporting is happening in terms of the adherence to the Justice 40 guidelines under that kind of circumstance. So we really need to be looking at this process from A to Z in order to be able to kind of affect the types of transformational change that we need. So that's what I would say as kind of opening comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie, as always. Daniel, building upon Jackie's comments, how can public and private entities implement a redistributive approach that explicitly supports a just transition to a living economy?
Okay, thank you so much for the question. I'm thrilled and honored to be here. I just want to first take a huge step back and just echo what Amy Laura Khan said earlier today. Since my last name is Cohen, and in that name there is a genocide going on in the Middle East right now, I think for me, I want to affirm, as someone who grew up in a Jewish and Guatemalan household with genocides on both half of the family, and I suspect most people in this room have genocide in the background of their family, to me the reason to fight the climate emergency is to prevent genocide. And that, for me, is enough of a reason to oppose the invasion in Gaza and to support a free Palestine. So there are questions of land and water and gas, but fundamentally, this is about saving human lives. Okay, wanted to say that. Not in my name, not in anybody's name over here. Okay, stepping back, I think also just want to name, to me, the history of the climate emergency isn't the history of climate science, but is the history of colonialism and racial capitalism. And that's the scale that we have to think of. And I think we've talked a lot about land here, and a statistic that floored me when I saw it is that until 1970, the majority of greenhouse gas emissions emitted was through land use, through deforestation and industrial agriculture. So fossil fuels are the main problem, but they're not the only problem. And any effort to say these questions of land sovereignty, land justice are separate from the climate struggle are scientifically illiterate. And I can send you the IPCC graphs to prove it. So to me, I think where we are is we are at the beginning of a fight over trillions of dollars in investment in the built environment. That is what the new age is, and the investments you laid out, as mind-numbingly large as they are just the down payment. And I think in that fight over those investments, we will either get a hardening of the eco-apartheid we live in now, or we will start to deconstruct that. And that's a huge, huge, huge fight, and we're just getting started with this initial tranche of money. So I think, to me, the question, and I'm going to answer your question, but it's like, what does winning look like even in this very early phase? and a couple things that animate our work at the Climate and Community Project, which is a progressive climate policy think tank. First, I think we know we're winning a little bit when people of color and working class people hear words like green investment and think, that's for me. That's my thing. Not that's nice, like Whole Foods is nice, wish I could afford to shop there, but like that's for me. I don't think we're there right now. A lot of folks here have heard of Justice 40, but I think until we're in a place where most black and brown people in this country hear the words green investment and think, yeah, that's for me, then we are not winning. And the other piece of that is we like to say that the Green New Deal is climate policy you can touch. Now, this isn't a Green New Deal, but although not all justice is tangible, if most people can't touch the justice, then it is not there. So as many times as it might say Justice 40 on the White House website, if no one here can touch it, I would submit that it doesn't yet exist. My early climate policy work has really been about driving public funds through public institutions to communities that need it the most. First, working with the Office of Rep AOC and Senator Bernie Sanders on a Green New Deal for public housing to upgrade every single unit of public housing in the country, and then a bill with Rep Jamal Bowman's office on a Green New Deal for public schools to literally upgrade every single public school in the country, half of which right now are in a state of severe infrastructural disrepair. That's not quite the same as the Justice 40 logic, but I think there's an overlap. But one of the intuitions, and maybe we can get into this a bit more in this conversation, is it is very hard right now for community groups to get federal funding, and we're going to talk about that. There's a both and here, where I think we might also think about how can we drive as much funding as possible into public institutions, which for all those problems at least have like bank accounts, and where so many of our communities are involved in fights over them already, over the quality of schools, housing, transit, we could go on. And so how can we think about the role of public institutions, public investment, in really getting money to where it needs to go and in a position where we can fight over it? So there is a process to get money to community-led projects and a process to get money into public institutions with bank accounts, with staff, that we can turn the heat up on them to really deliver. So I think that's something I really want to bring into this. And the last thing I'll just say in this opening remark, this isn't my area of expertise, but there are folks I work with where it is I think the public regulation of the labor market. There's been so much racism in the labor market. In the labor movement, as we know, there's been a big fight, and of course it depends on the sector and the union. But I think there's maybe a real opportunity here to embed Justice 40 ideas in a kind of high road, just transition framework, where we're really doing a lot of work to recruit young black and brown workers into the labor movement, into high, good paying, family sustaining jobs. And that is also, that's not just about a benefit in that individual's life, but shifting power. And so making the labor movement really a source of power in black and brown communities. It is in some cases, but that could probably be significantly expanded. That will really depend on the role of the public sector, how aggressive it's willing to get the federal government, and in some cases, state governments. So that's what I just want to get us going with, thinking really about the role of the public sector, public institutions as a complement to some of the other stuff I think we've already talked about. Can't wait for the rest of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And, so after hearing from all of you kind of about the challenges and barriers, there's a ton of legal barriers to applying for federal funding. There are a ton of resource barriers to applying for federal funding, right? I want to ground us also in a dreaming space here, right? So, I think we spend a lot of time on these panels talking about, what's hard about this and, don't spend as much time on the solutions or where we want to go. What do we want to build? So I want to ask a general question for the panelists, whoever wants to answer this. What do we want from a version of Justice 40 that we are not currently getting?
Yep, all right. So when we start to think about the federal funding in communities, we have a trust deficit, right? There are a lot of people that funding is going into that don't look like the people that should be receiving it. And so even when we create these new systems, we're going to create apps, we're going to create new applications. the individuals that need it, especially in Black and brown communities, especially individuals who may be facing some immigration situations, will just avoid applying and subjecting themselves to this rejection. So from Justice 40, I would like to see individuals that are able to connect with the mission of the funds and where they can trust the process and know that they can either use this to recover, to mitigate, or to prepare. And so we're just so far away from that right now. That's where a lot of my clients that come to me, they're like, I want help from the legal. I want to know that lawyers are going to help, but there's just so many people that are taking advantage of us. How do I know I can trust you? And so trust is kind of that deficit I would like to see Justice 40 bridge.
Jackie is curtailing my dreaming time. It's like an alarm clock, waking me up. It was about to get good, yeah. Okay, I'll just name two things. One, I've become, and through the leadership of others, a real convert on schools. 50 million people go to K-12 schools. They have probably 50 million parents. Bigger families, there's a few million teachers. So easily a third of the country touches schools daily. And I think there's a huge, huge opportunity. Schools to turn all schools into community hubs, and then resiliency hubs for when disasters hit. The people know where they are, they know where to go, they know the folks there. So I think a real serious investment in schools, which we have not seen, would be incredible and would demonstrate a kind of serious attention to like the future and to communities. The second one I would like to see is, we can talk about the policy options, but a commitment to the abolition of fuel poverty, complete. Like essentially nobody who can't afford their bills, and I mean that expansively, that's already half of Black folks around the country, 40% of renters. No one should have to worry about that bill. And that decoupling the retrofit of the house's energy system from being able to pay the bill, I think is so important. The idea you have to wait in line until 2034 till the retrofit comes. But then in the meantime, utility bills are like the main reason that people in places like Chicago take out payday loans. It's just not, it has to end. And it's so crazily invisible in mainstream climate conversations. And yet, utility bill is where climate injustice hits so many folks. So those are two areas where I would want to see like immediate, intense, and sustained action.
Yeah, I would just echo those comments and just add that one piece that a lot of times with the funding and looking at all the different agencies who have the Justice 40 funding or who are trying to advance it, that so much of it is based on infrastructure, like these infrastructure spending, and I feel like some part of it needs to go towards, in order to really achieve the aims of Justice 40, it actually needs to deepen democracy itself. It needs to make governance something that is shared by community. And so there needs to be an allowance, and this is what I meant about changing guidelines. There needs to be an allowance to actually allow those funds to go towards ensuring that every last person has an opportunity to weigh into the solution making. Because again, those on the front lines of the problem are closest to the solutions. And so for me, that would need to be a pretty big shift from what we see in the funding right now, but a necessary one in order to truly achieve the aims of Justice 40. So that's what I would add.
Thank you. So related to all of that, continuing to be in this dreaming space, do we look to philanthropy to help fill that dream that Justice 40 has not been able to fully deliver on? And if so, how? I'm going to kick it to you all first before I jump in. I can, yeah, I know, I'm trying to like defer moderator privilege, They're like, it's you're gonna answer this question. Okay, all right, I'm gonna take off my moderator hat, I'm gonna put on a panelist hat. So I think what's really interesting when we think about, I get this question all the time, can philanthropy fill XYZ gap? right? That the federal government is not doing its job, civil society isn't doing it, so like can philanthropy help fill the gap? And I come from movement work. I come from climate justice movement work. And I've been organizing for like 10, 11 years now. And I'm sure in this room there are many organizers who have been organizing way longer than I have. And so, my work is absolutely on the backs of y'all and my ancestors. And, like I'm trying to figure out how to word this. For me, in this work, coming into philanthropy, it was very clear to me that philanthropy was about power, right? About holding power over others, right? It is a system that is inherently built from inequity and continues to operate off of that inequity. So when we're asked a question, can philanthropy help fill this dream, right? When the whole purpose of philanthropy is to maintain the status quo of inequity, right? We're talking about wealth and money that comes off the backs of Black and brown peoples and indigenous peoples in this country and around the world, right? And we're talking, the folks that are holding this money are predominantly white folks with a lot of privilege, right? And a lot of ancestral privilege. And so when I don't think like philanthropy should fill the gap or has to fill the gap. I think they need to, because it is their duty to redistribute these funds, to move the money, right? Because this is money that is not theirs in the first place. So if I am in a dreaming space, quite frankly, and I'm fully happy to say this on camera, I don't want philanthropy to exist. Philanthropy should not have to exist. We should be able to move money to community control and community ownership. So if I am in a dreaming space around this and how philanthropy can help support that dream, I'm going to go back to digging in to the endowments until those endowments are gone. Because if we're going to be talking about, we're saving for a rainy day, the rainy day is here. The rainy day has been here, right? This is not. And so I think that it's philanthropy's duty to do that, right? It is not should they, could they, this is not a dance that we need to do. It is their duty to help fill the dream, and also needs to be explicit, right? We're not just talking about disadvantaged communities, disenfranchised communities. If we are not including race in this equation, if we are not being explicit about Black, brown, and indigenous communities, right, then what are we doing, right? Why are we coding language to leave race out of it? Because this is how we got here, right? Racialized capitalism is how we got here. And so philanthropy has a duty to right that wrong by moving the money concretely. And so that's how I would look to philanthropy. But
That's why she had to answer.
But I also want to see if maybe Jackie or Daniel no. You're like, no, we're good, we're done, all right. Okay, I will take that cue. I'm going to move us on. So, Latisha, actually, I want to ask this question specifically for you. We're talking a lot about equity and, why race is not often in this equation when it comes to federal funding. And so I really want to talk about, the impact of the Students for Fair Admissions decision and what the known restrictions and perceived risks of this decision are and how are public and private entities responding And what barriers does this create? And can we remove them?
All right. So that's a loaded question. So I do not proclaim at all to be an expert on this topic. So I'm going to kind of ground it in two things, both legal and as a parent. So my daughter is currently a high school senior. And she was like, man, they couldn't have held it off for 4 more years. I was like, I know, right? And one of the things that we're not talking about in addition to race is finances, which generally go hand in hand, okay? And so when we're looking at the perceived risk, okay, we need to understand that the perceived risks are really centered around these highly selective schools, okay? This was all governed by this notion that individuals were being left out of schools that should have been in school. Well, what's not being said is that means that they're stating that all of the black and brown children who are being admitted weren't qualified, okay? So now what you're going to see are individuals, I don't think, and this is my opinion, I'm stepping outside of an expert on this, that we're going to see drastic shifts, because what you've been noticing is that those students have been qualified all along, okay? What you will see is a shift in how you have to represent those individuals. What do I mean by that? Those individuals who are wealthy have coaches, okay? They have legacy, access, and networks, okay? Individuals who are low income have benchmarks. So the schools have already had equitable shares that are going to be distributed to low-income students. Many of them, as you've seen this year, have implemented what's called a no-loan policy, meaning that if you have zero, if your EFC, earned family contribution, is 0, they will meet your tuition needs, which is that endowment piece, okay? The bulk of the students who will be impacted will be your middle-income students. Because, as I told my child, we're too rich to be broke, too broke to be rich, right? So you don't have the money to pay the $100,000 for tuition, but at the same time, you actually don't, you can't get government assistance, right? So what do you have to do? And there's this notion of exceptionalism, okay? And that's the perceived risk that now students are going to have to overcome. And what do I mean by that? We went to a college tour. I'm not going to state where. But all of the students who had 4.0 GPAs, 30s on their ACTs, 1500s on SATs, were worried, crying, right? Can I go to school? Well, the answer is yes. But now you have to broaden that net, okay? And so now we need to dig back to our roots. Where are the Hispanic serving institutions? Where are the historically black institutions? Where are the Native American serving institutions? They've been doing their jobs the entire time, right? I am an attorney that came from an HBCU, right? So now we have to broaden the spectrum of where do I go to school? Where's my dollars going to stretch the most? And then where will I be valued? And so we have to stretch those notions. And once we force that hand, then we're going to see the expansion, because this isn't new. California implemented this, I think, in like 1996. We initially saw a drop, and then we saw another spike. But what we're also going to have to do is foster community across black and brown communities and across our Asian and Southeastern, South Indian communities, and all come together to realize that this was just perceived division to create the ability for this to go through.
Okay, I can't really follow that. But somebody has to talk next, so. Okay, I'm gonna be a bit more wonky, maybe. The question, one of the implications of this question is basically, what do you do if you're trying to target funding, anti-racist funding, for the climate when you can't use racial categorization as an indicator, essentially. So essentially, to be like super crude about one version of this, it's like you're going to make a bunch of maps about who gets priority funding, and you make those maps based on indicators, but those indicators cannot include racial categories. Okay. So this is this is like a problem, but it's like a many kind of problem. So I think I think one thing to say is that that's wrong, just obviously, because this problem is built on racism. That's how we got here. You know, if this were just an economic question, we wouldn't be here. As W.B. Du Bois says in Black Reconstruction, he talks about the post-Civil War. He says, according to the theory of labor and class unity, for economics alone, white workers and black workers would get together and we'd be living socialism. Obviously, that did not happen. That is the entire basis of American politics. So that's bad. So then the question is like what we can do. And I think what I want to say is there's a few different kinds of things. One is I think we have to keep fighting over the indicators, but proportionate to effort. Right now, environmental screening tools in California and New York federally have dozens of indicators in them. Now, as we all know, probably just income and race would be enough. I've been in rooms where folks are fighting over whether asthma cases can be included in the list of indicators. The problem is that we don't have really good data in every single census tract of the country of asthma cases, so then we impute it based on hospital admissions and likely living. And so I think one has to we have to be careful about how much time to put in these indicators, because at the end of the day, they're not going to make a huge difference into the ultimate outcome of which communities are chosen. We might also want to soften the weight of those maps, like not run every single policy through the same 40% of neighborhoods necessarily. Because if you do that, that means that you will have a community that is across the street that didn't get the money, and then the community on the other side that does, right? And it's not necessarily the case that like all the people in this country who've been screwed, all black and brown and indigenous disenfranchised folks all live in just those 40% of communities. This can be really important, I think, on issues, for example, like fuel poverty. So the government defines energy insecurity as meaning that in the last 12 months, either you had a utility disconnection notice, you kept your home at an unsafe temperature, or you sacrificed essentials like food and medicine to pay the utility bills. Now, by that definition, about half of black families are energy insecure. And about 25% of white families. To me, it would be reasonable to say, consistent with Justice 40 or some better version of Justice 40, every single one of those households gets help. It doesn't matter which neighborhood that you live in. So I think that the idea of Justice 40, it seems so simple and elegant, but there are boundary cases that we want to be careful of. The other thing is 40% of what? That's what nobody ever wants to talk about. And it goes both ways. So like agriculture, last I heard that involved the environment. Is that money included? There are a lot of forms. We say, oh, this is often linked to climate investments, but a very narrow definition of climate. So then the pie is much smaller. And then the stakes of who gets a piece are much higher. But we could be spending 2, 5, 10, 30, 50, 100 times more on spending that money according to equity criteria. Arguably, all money should be spent according to some kind of equity criterion, right? But then it goes the other way too. So I've been told of meetings inside the Department of Energy where they're like, oh yay, I know how we can fill up our quota of 40%. These carbon capture plants. We got to get those jobs into communities that need them. We got to make sure that those are going in disadvantaged communities. And then you get the jobs versus pollution thing, and it can get very, very dangerous. So 40% of what really matters. So all of this is to say, this issue of leaving out race by law is really, really problematic. And there's a whole bunch of other issues that are not getting attention that we also need to focus on to make targeted investment work. And I think just last thing I'll say is like this targeted investment thing comes out of California, where EJ movements and allied researchers put together maps, and they kind of came up with this idea of investing in environmental justice communities. And already that had problems. So for example, pollution didn't really go down in those communities. They might have gotten more loans for like rooftop solar, but the actual pollution didn't go down because this was in a cap and trade framework. Then we kind of got a very rapid adoption of Justice 40 federally, I think before movements had a chance to really robustly determine what that would be in a similar way to what happened in California or even in New York State. So I think this is a very complicated situation, and obviously the folks in power want to say, we gave you Justice 40, now you should clap. And then they said, oh, we couldn't get in a race, but we have income, so you should still clap. And I think what we need to come back with is a really like holistic, multi-sided response that addresses all these different vectors knowing at the same time that we're fighting now an even more tilted, disadvantageous terrain. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but that is how one wonk is thinking about this, who's doing some research on this topic.
Good. No? Okay. All right. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So we have about 20 minutes left, and so I have one last discussion question, and then I actually want to turn it over to y'all in the audience to ask us some very wonky policy, whatever questions you would like to ask us. So, open question. How do we shore up the public and philanthropic sectors to be the most proactive and bold they can be, especially within the context of the recent affirmative action decision? Where's some? It's me. Okay. I feel like the look. Like, you can talk about philanthropy. Well, I can talk about the philanthropic sector, but I am going to pass it on to y'all to talk about the public sector. So, obviously, I keep mentioning digging into endowments, but that is just one part of it, right? So, there are many different approaches that I think funders think of as being equitable, right? And some of it is like, well, we give away 6% of our endowment, so that it's 1% more than 5%, so that's the new ceiling. Or we will siphon off like 1/8 of our funding for the year to go to environmental justice or like climate justice communities, but we're going to take the rest of our funding and put it towards technocratic false solutions, right? But look, we did the good thing, right? And so, similar, Daniel was talking about like, oh, we have Justice 40, so you should clap. And then here are all these other barriers that kind of undermine Justice 40. It is the same in philanthropy, right? It's like, we want you to clap for the good thing over here, and we're going to continue funding all of this other stuff that is actively going to undermine the things that you are fighting. So when I think about philanthropic sector that is bold, that is equitable, all right? And about listening to the folks who are closest to the issue. So that means funding frontline and grassroots communities at the highest rate of all of your funding, right? When we talk about stopping the bad and building the new, we're talking about stopping funding false solutions just so you can be innovative and scalable, right? Frontline solutions are also scalable, right? They are scalable maybe in a different way than a one-size-fits-all solution, but they are scalable in place, right? We're talking about place-based solutions. The climate crisis is not like this one quick trick or one weird trick to like fix it all. That doesn't exist, right? So we have to fund diverse frontline, grassroots, place-based solutions that are unique to the places and how the climate is affecting that place and those people. I think something I've noticed as a trend in climate philanthropy is they like to remove the people from the equation. We're talking about decarbonization, right? Just removing carbon from the atmosphere as if that is the only solution to the climate crisis. But we as people, right, still have to live on this planet. I'm here to tell you, planet's probably going to be okay. We won't, but the planet will be okay. So when we're talking about funding frontline solutions, we're talking about funding it for us, right, on the ground. So I want philanthropy to be bold and stop the bad, not just give a small pot of money to frontline communities and then continue funding these technocratic solutions, right? I want philanthropy to actually work with folks in movement, right? So we're talking movement folks on your board, movement folks on your staff that are supported inside and out, not just one movement consultant who is a program officer and has to have an uphill battle because they're fighting against all of these power dynamics. So when I say bold, I mean folks who are closest to the problem and closest to the solutions should be working in this field. So I'll pass it on.
I think when I first heard the question, you were saying, how do we shore them up to do that? And so I think I could definitely say all the demands I want them to do, but it's like how to make them do it. It's the question that I was hesitating on because I'm just thinking about that. So to answer that question, I guess I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts as well, but just thinking about the ways that, like, how does this decision making happen? So we know that, like, the boards, for example, of philanthropy are important to do it, board education. Are there routes to do that board education? What's the next step beyond education? How do we escalate from there? So that's a question that I would maybe have for you. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I love this. I love this, right? We are being... So, absolutely, right? When you're thinking about who the decision makers are to getting funding to groups in philanthropy, you're often looking at boards and trustees. Sometimes you have living donors, right? So there's like legacy donors. So there's like funds that have been given gifts, and then there's funds that have active donors. And so I would say you're right. Beyond political education, we need to organize, right? And that can look like many different things. So at National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, we are digging into funder organizing. So a big part of my job is, what does it look like to talk to program officers, board members, trustees, like people at all levels of a foundation, right? Build relationships, do the political education, and shift the mindset, right? And that is, it's not an easy process, right? Because often what happens is you have a program officer who you're very aligned with, right? I talk to program officers at foundations that are only funding false solutions, right? And they're like leaving, and we're very aligned, right? Like I can talk all day about what it means to fund the front lines, and I'm like, yeah, I agree with you, but I can't even get in a room with a board member, right? I can be at a board meeting and not be allowed to speak. Be told by my executive director, don't speak or you will lose your job, right? So like the risk is high, right? So like how do we kind of disperse this power vacuum, essentially, right? And so I think that is related to what I was saying of when I talk about like, you know, being bold is like, how do we get movement folks in those strategic positions to organize from the inside and have them be supported on the outside from folks outside of philanthropy, right? So so folks who are like in philanthropic service organizations like NCRP, I'm happy to talk more about that. You know, we are looking at we're looking at the trends in billionaire climate philanthropy. So challenging the power of billionaire philanthropy in the climate funding space, right? So like folks who proclaim themselves to be experts in this field, but really they just have a lot of money and they love to be up on their high horse, right? So we're talking Bill Gates. Yeah, we're talking Bill. We're just as an example, right? And to use that as an example, I do not think that like Bill Gates is reading the blog pieces, the story. Like he's not, probably not even talking to the folks that I would talk to at his philanthropy, right? So, but how do you reach someone like Bill Gates, right? I mean, you have to do it by force, right? Someone like Bill Gates it's up here, right? You have to, you have to organize. That is the only way to do this, right? Because, like I said, philanthropy is a system that is built on inequity. They're not going to give up that power by choice, right? They might say all the right things. They might co-opt our language and say, oh, we care about a just transition. Here's our 20-page report on how we didn't work with anyone on the front lines. But we're going to say that we did, right? And so I think that... sorry, Jacqueline. I'm like stealing so much of this question, and we have 10 more minutes, so I do want to make sure we have some Q&A. But I think that organizing to get folks into board positions, organizing them to get into trustee, especially when it's a fund that is not run by living donors. Building out and organizing to get funding towards grassroots-centric intermediaries. So an intermediary or a pass-through fund is a fund where you have to fundraise that money from inside philanthropy, but there are movement-led intermediaries, right? Like the Solutions Project, the Hive Fund for Gender Climate Justice, the Fund for Frontline Power that just got announced. And those intermediaries, because they're movement-centric, know where to give the money, right? So oftentimes we'll tell folks, all right, look, if you can't get your board to donate directly to these groups, you can donate to these intermediaries. They know where to go. They know what to do. Do that, right? So anyone else? No? Okay. So we have about, or did you? No, I'm excited. Okay. So I would love to hand it over to our audience. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
I have a question that all of you have touched on in some capacity, and it speaks really to your last question, which is like how do we hold them accountable, or what are the gaps we need to fill? One thing that I have noticed about this whole Justice 40 initiative is that there is no enforcement or compliance from the federal. There's no framework for that. So my question is, as a person who has a background in compliance and can see some of these gaps, some more you have identified, which is great, how do we, as movement people, get to the table to help establish that framework and potentially even be a consultant or 8A contractor in executing that, implementing that framework?
I would say that would be a good request to put in with the WEJAC to see if the WEJAC can help the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Yeah, that they, yeah, I think that would be a good avenue to put that forward. That was my first one. Yeah.
I'll just say quickly, I do a lot of research in Sao Paulo and Brazil, and something that inspires me about some of the movements there that are able to be very influential is they just do full spectrum engagement. That's the term I just made up. They take meetings, they plant their people in the offices of politicians and the government. And when they're mad, they will say they literally invade the offices. They just go in. And then if they need to make a point, they might do something like, for example, city council is voting on a master plan that would include more affordable housing. They will just go in front of the city council and burn a bunch of tires and not move until the bill passes. And I think sometimes here we get it, there is a logic of like, it's access politics or it's outside. And I wonder what happens if we turn the crank on the militancy a little bit. And yeah, that outside pressure doesn't have to sacrifice inside access. In fact, outside pressure is what's going to make the access count more.
Yeah, very quickly. Fantastic panel, by the way. Yeah, really good. Practical question, because I just left the conference, Communities First, Invest in America, basically talking about federal funding and the interplay with philanthropy. But I'm still not clear, because I've heard horror stories of groups being granted the funding or accepted, but then a year later they haven't been paid and they're running a program. I run a nonprofit, we don't have the funds to implement, So I'm just curious if philanthropy will play a gap. Does direct pay, it come into the equation? How is that going to work? Because, again, even if it's a 0% loan or something from a foundation to get us moving would be very important. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a really great question. And I think what you're talking about here is a pretty common issue. And so there have been calls for philanthropy to provide what are called bridge loans, right? So this is, sometimes there is a fee, sometimes there's not a fee. It really depends on where you're applying. But these loans are supposed to help fill that gap. And there are a couple of pooled funds essentially that are working, so they, similar to intermediaries, they fundraise, they have an investment that can help provide some of these loans. So we're looking at there's the Invest in Our Future Fund, which is an $180 million investment. And then there's the Build US Pooled Fund, which is $50 million through 2026. And that's not all they do is those loans, but they also help support those gaps that we were talking about in implementing that federal funding and getting that federal funding. So I would definitely look into those. And there are also other programs as well that do that. That helps.
Hi, I just wanted to make a comment. First, fantastic panel. There's a growing movement in, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a really good on decolonizing aid. And there's the NEAR, it's called NEAR, Network for Empowered Aid Response. And the secretary of it is with Adesso Africa. And so they're looking at different solutions on decolonizing aid, decolonizing philanthropy in particularly in East Africa. And I think that we could do some of that research as well. And they're coming up with some good ideas to create social enterprise.
Thank you. And we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Yeah, let's do 2 at once. Yeah.
Oh, all right. That's always good. I'll keep it short. Just to this point about how, this infrastructure, to actually do this on the ground is lacking, and many of us who are trying to do it are very under-resourced. And it is extremely difficult to access either the capacity building and the technical assistance to be even able to, to get to the grant piece. And I could speak to it. There's a lot to say, and I've been doing this work, and it's really challenging. And it almost feels like you hit the lottery. If you get the email back from the Tic Tac, you happen to be down with the right formation, so you get that money, and otherwise you just do not. And so I know I'm not coming for folks when I ask. It's more like legitimately, like, how practically can we actually try to get this technical assistance and capacity building? Because you may or may not, some of these intermediaries, it's cool, they're in their regions, but sometimes you get lucky, you have to be connected, sometimes you don't. It's a lot out here.
Hey everyone, Angela, I'm with the Tishman Environment and Design Center. Really great to hear. I'm like sitting with the bold and innovative moment, but I feel like this is a really boring and in the weeds moment because it's like government funding, So I feel like I'm struggling because all the conversations I've been in is actually this support that you're talking about, like people that need legal assistance to do like tax accounting and tax law and institutional law, because I think that's the kind of stuff that we actually need right now. It's really in the weeds just to be able to get through the door on some of this. And there's an incredible amount of opportunity right now. So we could wait for the perfect moment and have all of our systems in place to be able to receive that. Or I feel like, we have to be doing like the really boring work of getting our institutions and our people infrastructure in place. So I'm wondering, from a legal perspective, where do you see some of even the legal entities changing the kind of work that you do to support communities right now? Because it is an upward hill right now for a lot of these communities.
I have a friend in this space who says he's trying to get Philanthropy to fund accountants to go work with these orgs, and they won't. So I'm just going to ask you, why isn't Philanthropy sending accountants to help these folks out?
No, the only thing I was going to say there is, of course, I assume, because I wasn't here earlier, but I assume they talked about the Just Transition Lawyering Network there. Oh, not really. Okay. Yeah, so between the Chisholm Legacy Project and the Gilmore Kandar a law firm are doing the Just Transition Lawyering Institute, where we're training lawyers to be able to support frontline communities to do just transition work, including this type of thing. And Taproot Earth is hosting the Just Transition Lawyering Network, which is the folks who are actually equipped and ready to work with communities and doing that kind of this work and beyond, including everything from helping folks to make community benefits agreements and other types of agreements. So like a whole range of Just Transition Lawyering. So just so you know that that's a resource that's coming forward. Yeah, just FYI. Yeah. And I think to Raya's question about, I mean, it is tough because it's definitely tough. Communities First, do you have a contact with Communities First? They're really trying to, like, versus, like, as you said, the Solutions Project works with folks who are in their ecosystem. They try to expand. The High Fund is geographically focused on the Southeast. And so, yeah, you're right, there are all those limitations. But Communities First, to my understanding, doesn't have any of those. And they're rapidly expanding. So I would definitely suggest to connect in there. Yeah.
So I think you also asked, how are legal institutions changing? So 2 ways. The first, well, let me reframe this. One of the issues that organizations have is the issue of who is the client, right? So if we have one organization that pays us, but then we're actually facilitating the work for someone else, there are ethical issues that are, who is your client, and then who do you have that confidentiality with? And so a lot of that has kind of safeguarded solo practitioners, those of us that are on the ground, from being able to facilitate that type of work, okay? So being able to have those intermediaries that can have that funding, that bridges that gap and then fund us, kind of solves that problem. So advocating more to your local bars, to the intermediaries, to form that type of extra layer that insulates that is one of the ways you can do that. The second way is to take advantage of pro bono hours from these large law firms. So generally, when first and second years come, they have to do about 200 hours of pro bono work that most people don't know. So if you just contact the actual law firm, if you find out that's their specialty, you can contact them and say, we're doing this type of grassroots organization. Do you have any pro bono hours that are available to help us? And they may only be able to do what's called limited scope. So they may just be able to do one grant, right? But that's one grant that you may not. And if you engage in that process, then it's kind of train the trainer. And so now you have someone in your organization that's gone through it. And so the next time you get a little bit scaling efficiency. So that's just some other resources that are out there.
Okay, thank you so much.